Welcome back to Sociology, droids. We're going to be doing a deep dive today into Eviatar Zerubavel's book,
Oh, yeah.
The Elephant in the Room, Silence and Denial in Everyday Life.
I love this one.
Yeah, it's from 2006.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to break down some of the arguments for you all since you're grad students.
Right.
We're going to be focusing on,
the good stuff.
the data and the claims.
The sociological meat of it.
And, how he kind of proves his points.
Exactly.
So that you can,
You've read...
say that you've read it.
Exactly.
Without having
work.
to read it.
Right. Well, Zerubavel, he really gets into, these conspiracies of silence.
Mm-hmm.
These situations where, everyone knows something's going on, but we all just pretend like it's not.
Yeah. Like a family secret.
Yeah, like those family secrets that everybody tiptoes around,
The classic, don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, exactly.
But he digs deeper into that. And he's saying it's not just
Right.
an individual thing.
It's a feature of society.
It's a sociological...
social thing.
Yeah.
Phenomenon.
He uses that story,
Yeah.
the emperor's new clothes,
Right.
to kind of illustrate this point.
Mm-hmm.
He points out that, everybody in this story,
Yeah.
from the weavers to
Yeah.
the townsfolk,
Yeah.
are participating in this,
This act.
this big performance
Yeah.
of pretending that this emperor is wearing these amazing clothes
Right.
when he's totally naked.
Yeah.
He even quotes, the emperor thinking to himself,
Oh, really?
I can't see a thing.
Wow.
But then he goes on and tells everybody, oh, this fabric is very lovely.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So, what Zerubavel is saying is,
Mhm.
this shows how, what we know
Yeah.
and what we're allowed to say
Yeah.
are in tension with each other.
Right.
It's not just
Yeah.
what do I know as a person?
It's what's okay to say.
In a group.
Yeah, within our social groups.
It's sometimes you see the elephant in the room,
Right.
but you just can't
But you don't say anything.
say anything about it.
Yeah. Because of the social pressure.
Yeah, how does that even
Right.
And
how does that actually happen?
work?
Yeah. How do we as a society
Yeah.
learn to ignore these giant metaphorical elephants?
How do we just ignore it?
That's where I think it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
He argues that different jobs
Mm.
train us to focus in different ways.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And he uses
Okay.
researchers and detectives as an example.
Okay.
It's researchers, they're trained to be
Right.
okay, let's isolate this variable
Yeah.
in a controlled setting.
Yeah.
Whereas detectives are
Mhm.
trained to be hyper aware.
Pick up on the little things.
Yeah, to notice even the tiniest details.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So what we're trained to do,
really affects how we see the world.
influences what we even notice in the first place.
Yeah, I can see that in professional settings, but how about in everyday life? Are there
A little.
social rules for what we're supposed to notice?
He talks about these rules of irrelevance,
Okay.
which are basically
Uh-huh.
what are we allowed to acknowledge in
Interesting.
different situations?
Okay.
And these rules are shaped by
Mm-hmm.
social norms, taboos,
Yeah.
and even just tact.
Oh, so sometimes we stay silent
Right.
to be polite.
Exactly.
You notice your friend's new haircut
Yes.
and it's oh,
Questionable.
but you don't say anything.
You don't want to hurt their feelings.
Yeah, you don't want to embarrass them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Zerubavel gives this great example from his own life
Really?
where he's at a dinner party
Okay.
and you can hear the couple next door
Yeah.
having this big argument. Oh my God.
But everybody at the table just politely pretends
I don't notice.
that they can't hear it.
Oh, wow.
And he writes, the fact that we did not even look at one another,
Oh.
let alone comment on what we heard, suggests that we were all well aware
Yeah.
of both the irrelevance rule in question and the need to abide by it.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. So we learn to filter out information
Yeah.
that might,
Yeah.
disrupt things,
Even if it's
even if it's super obvious.
super obvious. Yeah.
Like a loud argument.
It's so funny how we
Yeah.
can just pretend that things aren't happening.
Yeah, it's we're collectively creating this illusion of normalcy.
Yeah, but does that mean that all silence is
Yeah.
bad?
That's a good question.
Is there ever a time where it's actually better to just be quiet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that he doesn't
is.
shy away from.
Okay.
He acknowledges that, silence can be good too. In some cultures,
Right.
silence is a sign of respect. or deference.
Yeah.
And like we said before, sometimes you need to be tactful.
Oh, you got to think about people's feelings.
Right. You got to avoid saying things that might embarrass people.
Right.
Or make them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So it can be a tool
Okay.
for keeping things running smoothly.
Keeping that social order.
Yeah, maintaining that social order.
But I'm guessing it's not always that simple.
Right. Of course not.
Like, what about, like,
Right.
when people in power
Yes.
use silence?
You're getting at like a really key point here.
Okay.
He has a whole chapter
Okay.
about what he calls the politics of denial.
Okay.
And he says that like power imbalances are like a huge part of figuring out like what doesn't get talked about.
Right.
And who's the one doing the silencing.
So, like, in a real-world situation,
Yeah.
how would that...
Well, he uses the example of classified information.
Okay.
You know, like the people in power.
Right.
They get to decide, like, what is secret and who gets to know it.
Right.
Like, think about government secrets or even just, like, corporate secrets.
Right.
He writes, access to information, like access to many other resources, is a function of one's standing within a given social hierarchy.
So, like, where you are
Right.
determines what you can know.
Exactly.
And what you can talk about.
Your position in the power structure determines what you're allowed to know and like what you can talk about.
So how does that work?
Yeah.
Beyond just controlling information.
Well, he also talks about how like people in power can use silence to kind of like manipulate things and maintain their authority.
Okay.
He points out how throughout history, powerful groups have silenced dissent.
Silence anyone who disagrees with them.
Yeah, and anyone who criticizes them, he writes, the powerful often silence the powerless. Men often silence women.
Right.
Adults often silence children. Heterosexuals often silence homosexuals.
Yeah.
And members of dominant ethnic or religious groups often silence.
Right.
Those belonging to minority ones. So he's arguing that this silencing isn't always like
obvious.
Super obvious. It can be subtle and like sneaky.
Yeah.
Operating through these like unspoken norms and expectations.
So it's almost like you're not technically not allowed to talk.
Exactly.
But like the consequences are so bad that you just don't.
That you censor yourself.
You censor yourself.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he says that the self-censorship is often like internalized.
Internalized.
Meaning like we start to
police our own
thought
without even realizing
without even realizing it.
Wow.
He gives the example of like women who have been taught to be quiet and submissive, even when they have like
something to say.
Yeah, valuable insight to share.
Yeah, it's almost like
it is.
Those rules of irrelevance become part of who we are.
It's like we've internalized them.
Yeah.
To the point where they become part of our own self-concept.
Yeah. How does this all relate to the media?
That's a good question.
Because we're like inundated with information these days.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like silence is really a problem.
Yeah.
In the age of social media.
We can all like say what we want.
Right. That's a common misconception.
Yeah.
He actually says that the media can be a really powerful tool.
Yeah.
For like amplifying and silencing.
Okay, now
and voices.
Intrigued.
And perspectives.
Tell me more about that.
Well, think about like the media, you know, they get to decide what stories to cover.
Right.
How to like present them.
Right.
And even like how long they stay, you know, in the public eye.
Right.
Zerubavel uses this term, media-driven communal attention cycle.
Okay.
To talk about how like the media can like shape our collective memory. Wow. He writes, communal forgetting is often promoted by the tendency to accord attention mostly to what is new.
So once a story's not in the news anymore, we forget about it.
I kind of forget about it.
Even if the issue's still there.
Exactly.
It's like out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, it's like that, but like on a societal scale.
Wow.
Yeah.
So crazy.
And this like selective attention can be used to like downplay certain issues or even make them seem like less important than they really are.
Like
he uses the example of how the media can focus on like individual acts of violence, but ignore the like
the bigger
the systemic factors like poverty or inequality.
So it's like they can create like a selective silence.
Yeah, it's like selective silence.
Where we're not really talking.
Right, where certain issues just aren't.
About certain things.
Yeah, given the attention they deserve.
But how does that actually like work?
Right.
Is it like
Yeah.
a conspiracy?
Is it like a conscious conspiracy?
Or is it more... Or is it
Like
like...
a subtle?
Yeah, it's often like a mix of things,
Okay.
including like economic pressures,
Mm-hmm.
political biases,
Right.
and even just like laziness sometimes.
Yeah.
He writes, the media's inclination to play down or simply ignore certain issues
Yeah.
is often motivated by a desire to avoid rocking the boat or alienating powerful interests.
Mm-hmm. So they just want to like
You want to
keep everyone happy.
keep things running smoothly
Yeah.
and maintain that status quo.
So the media is like part of the system.
Right, they're part of the system.
And they don't want
And they don't want to mess it up.
mess it up.
Yeah.
But what about like
Right.
individual people
Yeah, the individual
like
work.
in the media?
Yeah, like the journalist.
Don't they have like a responsibility? That's where it gets kind of ethically murky.
Okay.
He points out that journalists
Yeah.
often face like a ton of pressure
Right.
from their editors,
Right.
publishers, or even the government
Wow.
to avoid covering certain topics or
Right.
to frame them in a certain way.
Oh, wow.
He gives the example of like
Okay.
journalists who reported on the My Lai massacre
Mhm.
during the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
and they faced censorship
Wow.
and even threats.
That's scary.
He writes, the decision to speak out or remain silent is never made in a vacuum.
So even if a journalist wants to break the silence,
Right.
they might not be able to.
Yeah, they might get silenced themselves.
Like they're caught
yeah.
in this web.
They're caught in this web of power relations.
Yeah. And they just can't.
And it makes it really hard
Yeah.
to challenge things.
What about the people who do try to break the silence?
Yes.
What does that look like?
What does that look like, and what are the consequences? Well, Zerubavel has this whole chapter on like breaking the silence.
Okay.
And he says that to like break a conspiracy of silence,
Mhm.
you need to do more
Then just talk.
than just like whispering about it.
You gotta be loud.
Yeah, you got to publicly acknowledge it in a
Okay.
way that like forces other people to confront it too.
So it's not enough to just talk about it with your friends.
You got to be like
Yeah.
the town crier.
Yeah. Gotta let everyone know.
Yeah, you got to shout it from the rooftops.
So how do you do that
How do you do that effectively?
effectively?
He talks about a few things,
Okay.
like humor,
Mm-hmm.
outspokenness,
Okay.
and like deliberate transgression.
Interesting.
He writes, humor can be a powerful tool for breaking taboos and challenging authority
Okay.
because it allows us to address sensitive topics in a way that is disarming and even entertaining.
So like satire.
Yeah.
Like using satire.
To point out like how ridiculous something is.
Exactly.
Think about like comedians
Right.
who talk about like serious issues like
right.
racism or sexism.
Mm-hmm.
They make people laugh,
Yeah.
but they're also like,
Challenging.
yeah, they're also challenging those assumptions.
But he's saying that humor
Yeah.
alone isn't enough.
He says humor alone isn't enough.
Sometimes you have to be.
Yeah, sometimes you got to be more direct.
Like confrontational.
Yeah, more confrontational.
Yeah.
He writes, outspokenness involves saying what others are thinking, but are afraid to say themselves.
So it's like being that one person
Yeah,
who's willing to say it. Like
Yeah.
the emperor has no clothes.
exactly.
But isn't that like
It is.
super risky?
It's risky.
Yeah, because like
Right, because you could,
people might not like you.
yeah, you could face a lot of backlash
Yeah.
for speaking out.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that, like,
Yeah.
breaking the silence can have, like,
Yeah.
serious consequences,
Like what?
like social ostracism,
Yeah.
professional repercussions.
Losing your job.
Yeah, even physical violence.
Wow.
He uses the example of, like,
Okay.
whistleblowers
Yeah.
who often face retaliation for,
Right.
like, exposing wrongdoing
So breaking the silence is
as, like, a courageous act.
a courageous act.
Yeah, it's about, like, standing up for what you believe in,
Yeah.
even when it's hard or dangerous.
But what about the people
Right.
who choose to stay silent?
Yeah, like, what are the
What
consequences
are the consequences for them?
of participating in these conspiracies of silence?
Yeah.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And he really gets into that.
Okay.
He says that participating in a conspiracy of silence,
Mm.
even if it's out of, like, fear or you want to protect somebody,
Yeah.
can really take a toll.
On you.
Yeah, like, psychologically,
Okay.
it can create this sense of, like,
Assonance.
dissonance,
Oh,
where
God.
you're, like, forced to deny
Your own
your own perceptions or feelings.
to fit in.
Yeah, in order to conform to the group. He writes, living with an elephant in the room requires a considerable amount of psychological energy.
Wow.
One has to be constantly on guard, carefully weighing one's words and deeds.
So you're always like,
You're always
just like what you say, second-guessing yourself,
Yeah.
trying not to, like,
Yeah.
break the silence.
That sounds exhausting.
It can be.
Yeah.
He also says that, like,
Oh.
participating in these conspiracies can lead to, like, guilt,
Right.
shame,
Yeah.
and even self-loathing.
Wow.
He gives the example of people who knew about the abuse happening at the Catholic Church,
Right.
but didn't say anything
Yeah.
because they were loyal to the institution.
Or they were scared.
Yeah, or they were afraid of what would happen.
Yeah.
He writes, the psychological burden of knowing but not speaking can be immense, leading to feelings of complicity and even moral corruption.
It's like you're betraying yourself by going along with it.
Exactly.
But beyond, like, the individual,
Right.
what are the, like,
social consequences.
the broader social consequences
of all this silence.
of these conspiracies of silence?
Yeah, because if we're all pretending that there's no elephant,
Exactly.
isn't that just making it worse?
That's one of his main points.
Okay.
He says that conspiracies of silence can have huge consequences for society as a whole.
Yeah.
They can erode trust, hinder communication, and even prevent progress.
On important issues.
Yeah, on important social issues.
So if we're all just
if we're all just tiptoeing around it,
tiptoeing around the elephant,
we're never going to
address it.
Yeah, we're never going to be able to address it effectively.
That makes sense.
He writes, conspiracies of silence can create a climate of fear and distrust where people are afraid to speak up or challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
He gives the example of
Okay.
the silence surrounding sexual harassment in the workplace.
Right.
For years, women were afraid to say anything
Because they were afraid.
because they were afraid of retaliation
Or that no one would believe them.
or that no one would believe them.
Right.
And that silence just let the problem,
Get worse.
get worse and even escalate.
It's like the longer it goes on,
Right.
the bigger the elephant gets.
The bigger and more powerful the elephant becomes.
So if these conspiracies of silence
Right.
are so bad,
Yeah.
why do we
keep doing them?
why do we participate in them?
What are the things that keep these elephants in the room?
Yeah, what are those forces?
That's the question he tackles head on.
Okay.
He says that conspiracies of silence aren't just...
individual choices.
Yeah. They're not simply the result of individual choices.
It's like bigger than that.
They're rooted in, like,
Yeah.
the very fabric of our...
Society.
Yeah, our social structure and cultural norms.
Wow.
He writes, we learn to ignore elephants from early childhood. We are taught which topics are appropriate for discussion and which are not. Who we can talk to about certain things and who we cannot.
So we're like socialized.
And socialized into silence.
Yeah.
It becomes part of, like, our unspoken agreement, our social contract.
Wow.
And this is, like, reinforced by all these social institutions.
Like what?
Family, school,
Hopefully.
religion.
Right.
The media.
So we're all kind of complicit.
We're all kind of complicit in the silence, even if we don't realize it.
So how do we change that?
Right. Like, how do we start to dismantle these conspiracies of silence?
Yeah. How do we make it so that people feel like they can speak up?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
And he explores that in the last part of his book.
Correct.
He says that to, like, break these conspiracies, we need, like, a multi-pronged approach.
So we got to change.
Yeah, we got to address it
Hearts and minds.
on both the individual and the societal level.
Right.
He talks about the importance of, like, individual courage
Yeah.
and willingness to speak up,
Even when it's hard?
even when it's hard.
Yeah.
He writes, breaking the silence requires a certain amount of audacity, a willingness to challenge the status quo and risk the consequences.
Right.
But he also says that, like, individual action isn't enough.
We need more.
We need to create a social climate
Yeah.
where speaking up is
Encouraged.
encouraged and rewarded.
Not punished.
Yeah, not punished.
Yeah.
So we need to create this culture of
Open.
openness and accountability.
But how do we do that?
Yeah.
Because these conspiracies are like,
Right, they're so deeply entrenched.
yeah, it seems like such a big task
It is.
to change them.
It is a daunting task,
Yeah.
but he argues that change is possible.
Okay.
And he points to, like, historical examples
Okay.
of social movements
Okay.
that have successfully, like,
Yeah.
challenged these long-held taboos,
Like
like,
what?
and power structures.
Yeah.
He writes, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the gay rights movement are all examples of how collective action
Right.
can break down conspiracies of silence and bring about profound social change.
So it's about like
Yeah.
finding your voice.
Minding your voice.
And then,
And joining forces
yeah.
with other people who share your values.
But I'm also wondering about, like,
Right.
education in all
Yeah.
of this. Because if we want people
Right.
to speak up,
If we want to create a society
yeah,
where people are more willing to speak up, you
Yeah.
don't really have to, like, teach them about these things.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
yeah,
He argues that education is, like,
key.
yeah, it's key to dismantling these conspiracies.
Okay.
He writes, by becoming aware of the unspoken rules that govern our social interactions, we can start to challenge them and create a more open and honest society.
So he suggests that education should focus on...
Yeah, like teaching people about these like rules of our relevance.
Mm-hmm.
The things we're all like trained to ignore.
Yeah.
He says that even just being aware of them can start to like chip away at those elephants.
It's funny, we're trained as sociologists
Right.
to, like, observe patterns.
To notice the things that other people miss.
Yeah, to see the things that other people don't.
Exactly.
But I'm realizing after reading this book
yeah.
that even we
Right.
are susceptible to these
All susceptible.
conspiracies of silence.
He actually talks about
Yeah.
how different disciplines like sociology
Yeah.
have their own like sacred cows.
Oh, interesting.
Like those unquestioned assumptions
Right.
or taboo topics.
That you just don't talk about.
Yeah, that are like off limits.
So even in academia,
right.
they're elephants.
They're elephants lurking in the corners.
Wow.
Makes you wonder what other elephants we're all
Yeah. What are we all?
collectively ignoring.
We know
Just because it's easier
than dealing with it.
than confronting them.
Yeah. That's the big question, isn't it?
That's the challenge he leaves us with.
Yeah.
To be more aware
Of
the silences
Yeah.
that shape our world.
Right.
To like ask ourselves why they exist.
Why are we not talking about this?
Yeah. And to think about the consequences
Yeah.
of both maintaining them
Right.
and breaking them.
This has been a really
Yeah.
thought-provoking deep dive.
Yes, it's been great.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding
Right.
of how silence works in society.
I really like about Zerubavel's work that he
Yeah.
doesn't give you like easy answers.
He doesn't tell you what to do.
He doesn't tell you what to think
Yeah.
or how to act.
He just makes you think.
He gives you the tools
Yeah.
to analyze these situations yourself.
And then we can...
Think like more informed choices
Yeah.
about when to speak up.
And when to stay silent.
Then when to stay silent.
Science. Like he's giving us like a
decoder ring.
sociological decoder ring.
Society to decipher the hidden messages in our social interactions.
That's a powerful tool
It is a powerful tool,
to have.
especially as a sociologist.
Well, sociology droids.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed this deep dive
Me too.
as much as we did.
It was fascinating.
And remember, next time you find yourself
Right.
with an elephant in the room,
Don't just ignore it.
don't just ignore it.
Ask yourself why it's there.
Yeah.
Who benefits from it being there?
And what you can do.
And what you can do to change things.
Yeah.
To change the conversation.
Until next time,
Yes.
keep those sociological imaginations firing.
Keep thinking.